Aloha, everyone. Welcome to follow-up to the Agile Talk. So last time we spent some time talking about the values. Oops, who did we lose? Lose Brooke? Okay, maybe Brooke's coming back. Last time we spent some time talking about the 4 Agile values and what the opposite of those values might mean. I want to start today by reviewing some of the 12 principles, and then we're going to talk about Scrum, XP, and Kanban, which are ways that we can implement these values and principles. So, okay, so again, we talked about what it would mean to value processes and tools over individuals and interactions. Talked about what it would look like to value comprehensive documentation over working software, etc. Let's take a look at these principles. This gets to a little bit more of the actionable side. But important thing to note about the principles, none of these mention sprints, stories, points, scrum masters. Like all of this is like a level above any of that kind of stuff. So I want to take a couple minutes and give you a chance to just read this. Check out the principles. All right, just like the values, sounds pretty intuitive even. Nothing controversial in here. And yet, still super controversial. Ask me some questions about the 12 principles. A couple things I want to draw your attention to. This one, harnessing change for the customer's competitive advantage. I really like the wording they used on that because I think it's very visually evocative. If change is a bull, you're not trying to kill the bull, you're trying to throw a saddle on it so you can ride the change. We're slapping a harness on it and we're using all of that energy to our benefit. We're not trying to prevent change from happening. If you've worked on a project before that has had a project manager or something like that, that's not how it works. They usually are trying to, whoa, we talked about this. We have an agreement. We have a contract, God damn it. Can't change your mind. But as we talked about last time, the reason customers change their minds are the environment has changed. They got exactly what they asked for and they don't like it. That it's no longer competitive. That somebody had a new idea that's better than the old idea. Any number of reasons. All of those are totally valid reasons to change the software. The only reason that we haven't always been doing that is, well, but if we change that, it breaks my entire prediction and my Gantt chart and all my predictive timelines and stuff. So if we don't have those, then we can ride that change and make better software. Another thing I want to call your attention to on here. Constant pace indefinitely. So this is related to that, like take lots of breaks, take lots of vacations, like that sort of stuff is in a traditional project, it'll go normal, 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 crunch time. Crunch time is, oh shit, the deadline is coming up and we don't have all the pieces integrated, and then some thing that we weren't expecting happened. And now everybody's got to work 15-hour days for the next couple of weeks until we get it all done. So we hit our ship date. There's no crunch time in Agile. You're supposed to work in very aggressively prioritized increments. And we are doing continuous delivery. So it doesn't all just get delivered at the end. We've been delivering the entire time. If we're delivering the most important stuff first, then at some point, we just run out of time. And so that's what you guys have been doing with your projects and stuff also. And then technical excellence. It's another mile marker I'd call your attention to. I think sometimes Agile has a reputation, usually by people who haven't practiced it, for being sloppy. Because if you can't predict stuff, if you don't have all the big requirements binder, if we haven't figured all that stuff out ahead of time, how could it not be sloppy? In fact, it's the exact opposite. We want our code to be fucking bulletproof. And when we deliver something, it is done. Means not other things that need to be done or anything like that. You should have a complete project that if nobody ever touches it again, like it is as done as possible. And so the project should basically be in that state in between every single feature that you do. And like this sort of makes sense because if you were going to add a feature to something, like it'd be a lot easier to add that to an existing project that's like super nice and polished than it would be to try to figure out how hard it would be to do that if you haven't built any software yet. And that would maybe not be the case if you were building, if you're adding a feature to some sloppily designed software. You go like, Jesus, this would be easier if we just started over. That's the thing you're trying to avoid. And then one last thing I'll call your attention to is self-organizing teams. If it's not self-organizing, who's organizing it?
Management?
Mm-hmm. So we are explicitly saying the manager doesn't organize the team manages the team. Like a pretty common thing in almost any Agile implementation is nobody's allowed to tell you what to do, which like turns the entire management paradigm kind of on its head. Instead, managers say what done looks like. They'll say whether or not something's finished, and they can say what's important, but they can't tell you what to do or how to do it. Cool. Last call for questions on Agile principles before we start talking about methods.
In the concept where you have self-organized teams and no direction per se from management, are you checking in on progress during stand up, stand down?
Continuously. The difference is that, let's say you show somebody something in progress and they go, shoot, I don't like this. It needs to be more like this. They can absolutely say that. What they can't do is say, all right, I want Ben to work on this part of the solution for it. And Logan, you're going to work on this part, and I want you to use the following tools. That's the kind of management that's not allowed.
So there is that sense of like, hey, where are we at on this? What's the holdup kind of thing?
Absolutely. And in fact, the way that most Agile teams handle that is with things called information radiators. Since questions like that are very common, we want to lower the cost of providing that information. Because if you have to like do a whole bunch of number crunching and make charts and all that kind of shit on like a request basis, it's too much friction. And so instead, we can use some of the Agile tools we're going to talk about in the next part to create these like status update, progress kinds of things in real time. And so if anybody wants to know what the blockers are, how far we are, what's done, what's not done, they can look at an information radiator instead of having to talk to a person. Cool. Other questions about principles?
Yeah, so I don't know if it actually fits in with self-organizing side, but if you have a project and if you wanted to go ahead and take a lead of your whole project, and how do you know that we step in over too much and not also within the group that, you know, anyway, not to delay the progress of the group or the project?
So I think I caught most of that. Rephrase that.
So if you don't have anybody delegating your project,
right,
and you're working, you know, with your peers and stuff, how do you know what is the right length of measure that you should take outside of your own, you know, section? Can you help somebody else too much, or is
okay, so I understand now. In an Agile team, there is no individual work. In fact, in XP teams, which we'll talk about next, you're not allowed to work on code by yourself. You have to pair 100% of the time. That's one of the XP rules. But even in like Scrum, where they don't really have any opinions about that, all of the work is owned by the entire team. So you might be working on some part of the code base right now, but that doesn't make it your code. And so it's a very shared attitude toward ownership of all of the code and all the little parts of it.
So I'm kind of curious with when I think of the self-organizing teams and how you described it, it would essentially almost erase like the hierarchy of like managers and normal like the employees. How could you change a company that's set in a hierarchy style without complete and utter chaos? Like how could you transition smoothly?
One team at a time. So if you flatten a team, and so we really don't have any kind of hierarchy that we explicitly acknowledge. Now, like it's worth mentioning, there's always some implicit hierarchy. There's people with more experience, with more skill in a certain area, but the difference is it's contextual rather than something that you were given. You might understand a problem better, either because of some background that you have or some like smaller skill set that you have. So in that context, you might have more authority than somebody else. But it's on the explicit side of it, we don't acknowledge those kinds of things. And we don't automatically defer to somebody. It's a lot more like, well, if you want to be a leader, then earn it. Lead some people, try to get some followers. But like, it's not the thing that a manager can give you a title and now everybody has to do the things that you say. But yeah, in practice, there's always some of that informal hierarchy. And I think that's mostly a positive thing. And then as far as like how that goes larger in the organization, well, if this team flattens out and this team flattens out and this team flattens out and this team flattens out, and each team is responsible for delivering complete features. Well, you think, well, what other functions are really needed in the organization? And it ends up just squishing a lot of the middle tiers of management, because if we don't need this person tell this person tell this person tell this person what to do, well, then I guess we don't need all that hierarchy anymore. Now you still have managers, and you still have directors, and you still have executives, and you still have a lot of that kind of stuff. But I think it changes the pressure to, like, they need to do a lot more justifying of their jobs than you need to do justifying of yours.
So I imagine the middle management is probably the one that pushes back the hardest over Agile.
Correct. Because yeah, if the team self-manages, what do you need the managers for?
True.
Now, in reality, like, there are management tasks like hiring and like expense reports and like some of that kind of stuff. You still have managers, but I think that their role is radically downplayed in something that doesn't have so much hierarchy. In a lot of cases, it becomes not like, oh, well, I do the expense reports because I'm in charge. It becomes like, I do the expense reports because I'm doing expense reports right now. that would be like the self-organizing approach to it.
Yeah.
And like this happens like in real life with companies. Probably the best example of this is Valve. Company makes Steam and Half-Life and that kind of stuff. They don't have like any formal assignments to any projects or anything like that. People just, all of the desks and chairs have wheels on them, and so you just make whatever teams you need to make. Another like fairly common example of this sort of chaotic organization system is Zappos. They use a system called Holacracy, which reimagines the organization as a series of concentric holes. And so the entire organization is one hole. And then you have these holes within those that are like, I work on this product or this feature. And then all the way down through that. And you can be in more than one hole, and they're like short-term kinds of things. Like, oh, I'm currently in this hole probably for the next couple of weeks, and then I'm going to drop out of that one and join this one. But it brings a little bit more structure to it. So like a hole has to have a charter, and it has to have like a person who's responsible for that hole. But they're just ad hoc. You can make them and get rid of them and change them day to day.
How do you talk about time in regards to communicating with clients and things like that?
Sure. This is probably like one of the most common questions in Agile is like, all right, sounds great, but I got deadlines, God damn it. And the thing that changes, that's actually a really good segue to, by the way, this is a good example of self-organizing teams. So we take your guys' requests in the morning. This is my notes from staff stand-up. I write them down on the side. And you go, cool, who wants to teach something? And then we put our names on lessons we want to teach. And we go, cool, what times do you want to do it at? And then you go, oh, well, I got this thing. I got a repair person coming over this morning, so I want to do mine in the afternoon or whatever. Or one that happened is Christine originally wanted to do this one at 10, but I thought some mod 2s might also want to go to this one. So I was like, shit, can you actually bump that up a little bit? But at no point were Brian and Josh telling us what our assignments for the day were. We had a pile of work in front of us. We cut out 2 things that we didn't think could fit in with the day so well. And then otherwise, we just decided amongst ourselves who was doing what when. That's self-organization, self-management. All right, so as far as talking about time, let's talk about Scrum first. So there's 3 major families of Agile methods right now. It used to be more. Scrum, XP, and Kanban. All of these are just different realizations of those Agile principles and values. So in Scrum, I want to make a note to talk about time over here. In Scrum, there are 3 roles on a team. There's a Scrum Master. There's a Product Owner. And there's a team member. That's it. There's no senior UI architect. There's no back-end strategist. There's no junior, whatever the fuck. You're just one of these 3 things on a Scrum team. So a Scrum Master, I'll say that they're team facing. And they're basically the only job, 2. They unblock team members and they make sure the rules of Scrum are followed. They're like a referee, kind of. And since they're team facing, they also end up being kind of like coaches in real time. I'd say they probably have the best pulse on like who's doing what. They can help connect team members together. They facilitate conversations. So that's a Scrum Master. A Product Owner is customer facing. And they have 2 main jobs. They say when something's done, and they say what's important. That's it. That's all they're allowed to do. Team member does all the work. Ta-da! So 3 different roles that we can have on a Scrum team. Have to have all 3 of them. There are no Scrum teams that don't have Scrum Masters. There are no Scrum teams that don't have Product Owners. There are no Scrum teams that have some other role in it. Scrum is very prescriptive about the process. And not doing these things might be a totally fine team, might even be better than this, but it's not Scrum. Scrum is hyper-specific. So some other elements of Scrum is that you work in 1 to 3 week sprints. Usually 2 weeks. So a sprint involves selecting work from a backlog. So you have all these different features that somebody could want. That's all the backlog. Product owner says what's important. So they go, all right, well, these things, these are like the 10 things that we want to get done in this sprint. One of the first things that is commonly done, this isn't a requirement for Scrum, but it is really common, is you turn features into stories. And then you point the stories. So a feature might be like button. A story would be something like, as a user, or as a, shoot, we can get more specific than that. So if it's a like button on Facebook, it might be something like, as a regular Facebook user, or you could even be more narrow than that, as a Cheryl, maybe Cheryl is like a user persona that like has a lot of other definition around it. I want a like button so that I can show somebody else which of their posts I like the most. So you'd call that a user story. And then user story might have some criteria around it that the team talks about. They go, all right, well, I'll know that this works when I can go onto this page if I can indicate that I like something and then it persists. So we'll call that acceptance criteria for a story. And you usually put them on little index cards. You can do them in Jira or Trello or whatever, but there's a lot of benefit in having it in a physical card, especially a small one, because you're not supposed to put a ton of detail on these things. It's part of like the unearned precision kind of thing that we talked a little bit about last time. Your understanding of how a feature works is brain to brain. There's no way you're going to capture what all of those differences are, all the things that make the feature and make not the feature on any kind of written documentation. It's a shared understanding. So you write some notes on it so that you don't forget conversations you've had, but it's not a substitute for having a conversation about what the feature is. So, all right, so we turn these features into stories and then we point them. So pointing is a relative estimation. And so like a common way to do this is, all right, so first couple days, we see what features we can get done. Whatever the easiest feature we got done is, we call that a 1. And common ways to do points are Fibonacci sequence. So all right, if that was a 1, is this twice as hard as this? Is it 3 times as complex as this? And so, and then as the numbers get bigger, they get more spaced out to reflect how much more uncertainty there is inherent in something that's bigger. And so you go, okay, well, that was a 2. What about this other story? Would we say it's closer to the one that we said was a 1 or closer to the one that we said was a 2? You don't spend a ton of effort on this. We're just trying to get some relative sizing in here. Teams will also do this with t-shirt sizes, which has some ups and downs, but we want some relative estimation. So then we work in our sprint for 1 to 3 weeks, and then however many of these points that we got done, we call that our velocity. So if a team was able to get 25 points done in their first sprint, we say, all right, well, our velocity is 25. And then for your next, and this is back to Logan's original question about time, we go, all right, what can you get done in the next 2 weeks? And you go, about 25 points of stuff. So when you pull the work off of the backlog and you turn the features into stories and you point them, you're not going to commit to more than 25 points because that's about what the team's been able to get done. Now, maybe the team does 30 points or 15 points or some different number. You're trying to make a rolling average over time of like, yeah, sometimes we get more done, sometimes we get less done. But on average, our velocity is 25 or 30. And it changes. It gets a lot more volatile in the beginning, and then it tends to kind of even out. But it's a rolling average. And then we can use that to make time projections. So we go, all right, well, is this thing going to be ready for the big show in November? We go, okay, well, based on our current velocity and the stuff in the backlog, this is probably going to be more like December. However, since we harness change for our customers' competitive advantage, then we can go, but if that needs to be done earlier, then we can take some other things out. Which of these things on the backlog is less important than that thing that you want in November? And so you use that to empower the customer to make choices. They can't make stuff happen faster. Like part of the premise of all Agile stuff is that everybody's doing their best work. So they're not holding anything back. So there's no more work that can get done. That's the thing that we're fixing. rather than a date. But we can change what gets done within that date by reprioritizing things. I'm trying to think if there's other important aspects of Scrum that you should definitely know about. Oh, the retro. A couple of other ceremonies. At the end of every sprint, you demo your work with the customer. Everybody stands up there and they show, it's supposed to be no smoke and mirrors, no videos, no like fancy productions. Customers in a room, you're in the room with them, you show them the things that you made. You walk through all of the features and they love it, they don't love it, they think it's fucking bullshit. And like even one of the most powerful ones, let's say you didn't get anything done in your sprint. It happens. The team has to stand up there in front of the customer and say like, we didn't get anything done this week. It's embarrassing. But it's one of the ceremonies in Scrum. So then after your demo, the team retros and figures out what they could have done better. And then rinse and repeat. Every 2 weeks or so, this entire cycle happens. Stand-ups are usually also a part of this. Stand-ups are not status meetings, which is one of the easiest ways that people screw them up. Stand-ups are for the team. Think about when we stand up together every morning and we're trying to figure out what the best use of our time is in the day. That's what stand-up is. It's the team having a conversation with each other, not giving status reports to a manager. They're trying to figure out, all right, is there anything blocked right now? Is anybody stuck on something? Is there something more important we could be doing with our time? Like, that's a stand-up. And all of this stuff together is Scrum. Ask me some questions about it.
Can you give some examples of what a non-school oriented version of stand-up would be?
Yeah. So you have 6 people standing in a circle, and everybody takes turn answering the 3 questions. The 3 questions are, what did you get done yesterday? What are you planning on doing today? And are you blocked on anything? And so it's often facilitated by the Scrum Master, but it doesn't have to be. So everybody says those things. It's explicitly not a problem-solving meeting. And so if you're stuck on something, you're not coming up with the solution for that in stand-up. Stand-up should be like 5 or 6 minutes long. But it might be like, cool, sounds like you and me need to talk about that more after this. So the wrong way that stand-up happens is it's a 45-minute long meeting where everybody like presents what they did or didn't get done to the manager, and everybody says some variant of like, yeah, still working on that thing from yesterday and the day before and the day before. Yeah, I'll get there. Then everybody does that. Just a really long-winded version. It takes forever, and everybody hates it. And everybody's sitting down the whole time. The reason it's a stand-up is it's supposed to be uncomfortable. If it goes on too long, people start looking for places to sit or things to lean on, and that's your sign that you've gone on too long.
So what was the third one again? Blocking or blogging?
Yeah, what are you blocked on? Is there anything you're stuck on right now? And so that might be because I asked the customer and they haven't written me back. That might be, I just don't know how to do this. Or it might be, I'm actually not all that clear about how this integrates with this other thing, question you have or something like that. All of those are blockers.
And then just at some point during the day, you get together with people and that gets addressed.
Correct.
Cool.
Yeah, often right after stand-up.
Yeah, maybe you tap somebody else and you're like, hey, yeah, could you?
Exactly. So it's something like, man, I'm in over my head on this PHP, whatever. somebody goes, I got you. Let's chat over stand up. Other questions about Scrum?
So what would be the best way to do the demo when you don't have what you were expected to meet? Like in a productive way instead of just like, well, sorry, don't have it. Oh, well.
Well, so it shouldn't be a surprise to the customer. Part of the product owner's like daily duties are staying in like daily communication with the customer. And so as you start getting closer to that demo, it's like, by the way, I'm not all the way sure that this one feature is going to make it into the demo, just heads up. So it shouldn't be any kind of surprise. In my experience, two things are true. One is that if you slip up every now and then, like it's not that big a deal. Like the working world is so much less focused on hard deadlines and shit than school told me that it was going to be. Now, if you're consistently missing stuff, that means your velocity is dropping, and it's dropping faster than you can keep up with how fast it's dropping. That points to a bigger dysfunction. And so that's something that like your Scrum Master in particular probably needs to figure out. Why does our velocity keep dropping? And the answer is usually like lack of technical excellence. You're just making bad software and then trying to put more bad software on top of that. It's slowing everything down. And then another thing that's true is when you're continuously delivering software. So this is doing it every 2 weeks. It's technically periodic, not continuous. But if you're able to reliably just deliver new features on any kind of cadence, people stop asking you how long something's going to take. It reliably happens. If every once in a while, like I'm just getting new features every couple days, every couple weeks, and I'm in control of what those features are, I don't go like, well, what are you going to have done in January? Like that stops being a conversation.
So during the sprint, at the start of the sprint, you have your goals for the end of the sprint.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have an issue with the structure of that sprint in the middle of the sprint,
yeah,
is it proper to kind of raise them at that time, or just kind of just ride through it and then see if trust the system and finish the sprint?
So what do you mean by an issue in the middle of the sprint? Give me an example.
So let's say that you're subjected to do some things, like you're just supposed to do something, and you find like, oh, you know what, instead of me actually doing this part now, there are things that needs to be done before that. So should I just do that, or should I continue working this through until the end of the sprint?
So it depends. If it's something that's structurally necessary to get your feature done, then it's part of that feature. If it's something that like, oh, while I'm in here, this would be really nice to have, you're not allowed to do that. That's a separate thing. And Scrum is a lot more strict about this than XP is. Definitely more strict than Kanban, where you aren't allowed to add anything in the middle of a sprint, but you can drop stuff. So if you're working on something, you're like, oh, we were way wrong about this. This is way more complicated than we thought. Then you drop it out of the sprint and you re-estimate it. You repoint it at the beginning of the next one and reprioritize it. But the nature of pointing is that it's already a fairly fuzzy measurement. It's not in days or hours or anything like that. And some of them you're going to underestimate and some of them you're going to overestimate. And ultimately, it all sort of washes out. More questions about Scrum?
I was wondering, when you're constantly giving updates, do you, as the team member, give the updates directly to the client, or does the Scrum Master or the product owner interact with the customer?
The product owner is like the person who manages that relationship directly with the customer, or they're not necessarily the only person who can talk to them. Things like updates, that's more of like a product owner kind of job, but anyone on the team should be able to talk to the customer to get clarification on things. It's not supposed to be like a telephone game thing where like, well, I asked my product owner and they asked the customer. Everyone should feel free to talk to everyone.
Okay, because I was wondering if that would cause any issues, like submit a ticket to product owner. Oh, well, product owner went home or didn't want to do it, and then no one communicates.
Yeah, the like ownership of the relationship is really the product owner.
Okay.
Other questions? Cool. So a thing you might have noticed is that Scrum doesn't have any opinion about how you actually do the work, just how you organize the work. XP is the opposite. XP has very little opinions about how you organize the work, but lots of opinions about how you do the work. So it is also common to have stand up and points and velocity. It is, say, no fixed roles. XP doesn't care if you have something like a Scrum Master, which they call a coach, or something like a product owner, which they call a customer. You can have those roles. You can have 3 of them. You can have none of them. XP doesn't care. XP is generally 1 week iterations. They don't call them sprints, iterations. So you're in a 1 week cycle, and they're like ceremonies at the beginning, are similar. They're less structured. It's called an inception. So you incept features, and that's the time where you talk about what's involved with them, what the acceptance criteria is. Like that's where you have that conversation. And then there's a bunch of technical practices that you follow in XP. So those include pair programming. That's what pair programming is from. Test first. So TDD is also from XP. So if we say, all right, well, I know that something is done when these conditions are met, then you write those as tests so that you get that feedback in an automated way. You need to decide what done looks like first. Some other technical practices are CI and CD. CI is continuous integration. So as you're making changes to code and other people are making changes to code, you are continuously pulling in each other's changes. So everybody's working on the most current version of the code. It makes any like integration problems jump out immediately. And then CD is continuous delivery. So this is as soon as your tests pass, that code goes live in production. That's CD. And all of that happens automated. Your GitHub or whatever goes, oh, cool, a change to the master branch. Starts off an entire automated pipeline to get that in production immediately. Let's see, some other technical practices in XP. See if I can find more. On-site customer, refactoring. It's our technical practices. System metaphor is kind of an interesting one. This isn't part of Agile, but it's very closely related. There's this thing called domain-driven design that's more business side than purely technical side. But it's about having a shared language for what metaphor you're using for this system. And so like an example would be like in this program, we have mods. And that's like a metaphor that we use for these 3-week groupings of things. And if we all understand that the same way, then we can communicate a very dense amount of information in like single words. I'd say these are probably the main technical practices. And so it's XP. XP is extreme programming. It's extreme because you're saying, all right, well, if pair programming is a good idea, why would we ever do anything else? Let's do it all the time. If test-first programming makes better programs, then why would we ever do anything else? Let's do it all the time. If CI and CD help us catch errors earlier and like make problems bigger and louder so that we can do something about them, we should be doing those all the time. That's extreme. Cool. Asking some questions about XP.
Is there a unit testing with JavaScript?
Oh yeah, tons. So in my Lodash talk, I did some of it. So this is a unit test in Jest, which is a JavaScript testing framework. So the point of my talk was that I could turn this data into this data. And so the test runner says, well, I expect transforming the old data to equal the new data. So I did that before I wrote a single line of code. And then all these like smaller things, exact same thing. I go, okay, given that I have this and I want it to be this, I expect that when I call this function in this way, then I get this thing. So doing those things before you write the code and then just trying to make it past them, just like you do in the Learn Labs, that's TBD. This has some depth to it. So like these are pretty simple examples. There's also a tool called Cypress, which I get a whole lot of action out of. Out there. What about? But these look kind of like this. You like tell the browser to go to a page, and then you look up elements and assert that they say the things that you think they should say. Or that like this image has the right shit on it. Those are another kind of JavaScript test. It's browser automation. But same kind of thing there. And then there's a way that you can write those in like plain language that your customers can write for you. That's fucking agile. If your customer can write your tests, that's hot. So what that looks like, that's a cucumber. Nope. This one. Cool. Here, this is what these look like. Oh, there. So your customer, or somebody, doesn't have to be the customer, but it really helps when it is. They write something like this. No technical language required. Parts of it are kind of fussy about syntax, like all the things in colors and all the numbers. Those are specific. And so this is called a gherkin spec. What you do with it is it automatically gets connected to these technical implementations of those. And then, so you write in JavaScript or Ruby or whatever, how you would know that that worked. So if this says, I should see int roles remaining, we get the number of roles remaining. And then you write something that will look up something with that test selector and verify that it has that number in it. So then your customer goes, oh no, psych, it should actually be more like this. They can change the test themselves, it'll fail, and that is a way to communicate that something needs to be different. But what you're trying to do is rather than like come up with an abstract specification for all the different behaviors of the software, you just come up with examples of how it should work. And so rather than having like a bug, you have an example that you didn't find ahead of time. But given that I'm on the main page and I have 10 roles remaining, when I increment the roles remaining, I should see 11. Very, very plain language. So all of that is like a variant of TDD called BDD, but it all falls under the category of test first. More questions about XP?
Is TDD starting to be pretty widely implemented throughout most of these practices?
No, God, no. All of this stuff is still controversial 20 years later. TDD is one of those things that a lot of places will give lip service to, and they'll go, but you can't test our stuff, it's too complicated. Absolutely not true. So I would say all of these practices are still fairly rare. Everybody's got all kinds of excuses for why they can't do them. They'll say like, oh, we can't do pair programming because we have a lot of stuff to get done, and so we can't get half as much work done. It's like, well, that's not what pair programming does. Pair programming gets more work done by increasing quality, so you don't have to rework things as much. And like, if you believe that, then pair programming gets way more work done. If like this is some religious superstitious ritual that you kind of don't believe, you go like, oh, okay, cool, but I got to get work done. And I would say that's more common than like people who really drink the Kool-Aid on this stuff. And usually the reason people don't do some test first kind of thing is because they don't know how. It's a discipline, it's really hard to do. One of the reasons that we don't teach it here, or it's not like an official part of the curriculum, is that it's all about prediction. And so you have to be able to predict what something should be. And that's a really hard thing to do when you're new. And fuck, even when you're pretty experienced, it's its own discipline. It takes a while to get good at. Because what usually happens when somebody starts with it is they write a bunch of tests. They don't actually test anything important. They don't make the software any better. They don't give anybody any confidence. They have to redo all the tests almost immediately to go, well, Jesus, that was a waste of time. Like, it took me twice as long to do my work. It didn't improve quality at all. So fuck TDD. It just takes practice to make tests that are actually meaningful and actually help you. Other questions about XP? All right, let's talk about Kanban a little bit. So Kanban is the oldest on this list. Kanban goes back to, I want to say the 70s. I believe this was a Taiichi Ono thing. Let's see. Toyota production system. There we go. Kanban was one of the later ones, so early 70s. Kanban, it comes from manufacturing, comes from Toyota specifically, and has like the least opinions of all three of these. So Kanban is about restricting flow in a system. It doesn't tell you what the system should look like. It doesn't tell you what your team should look like. And so it makes Kanban like a really attractive place for teams to start. They don't need to change anything. Scrum and XP, like to be successful, in a lot of ways you need to redo your entire organization. Kanban, no such restrictions. Kanban is about visualizing all of your work as a flow. So like, you have these columns that represent the different steps of a process. So let's say you're Kanbaning some kind of waterfall process. You might have like a requirements gathering column. You might have an analysis column. You might have a planning column. And then you might have a doing column and a testing column, and then a redoing column for stuff that doesn't pass the test. And then like a retesting, and then like a ready for deployment, and a deployed. So in like a waterfall system, that's like how you might represent that as Kanban. So you take a work item. Over here's the backlog. So you have a work item, and it goes from one column to the next. Let's say something doesn't need to be redone or retested, or they can skip a column. Generally, you don't want things to cycle. That's what you're trying to flatten out. So you just represent it with more columns. And so then we can have all kinds of tickets over here that move through this system. So, like, pretty straightforward so far, no magic to it. The magic comes in with a thing called WIP. Work in progress limits. So you say, all right, well, there's only two things are allowed to be in this column. One thing here, three things here, two things here. You're trying to make this the smallest number possible. And you go, all right, so if I already have two things in this column, nothing else can enter in until something moves out. And so what it ends up doing is smoothing out the flow of work. Because what will happen in a lot of, especially waterfall teams, is you'll have something in here like the analysis or planning or something like that, and they can just crank through this shit. So they end up shoveling all of these items, and then in the next column, in doing, you end up with 50 things that are like ready to be worked on. Well, you can't get 50 things done. And so you do 1, 2, 3, 4. Meanwhile, all of this like work that's waiting for you is inventory. It's getting stale. Requirements are going to change. It's not going to make sense to do them that way anymore. And so then you're going to have to go back and reevaluate those. And now you have to rework those fucking things. So instead, if some part of this system is blocked up, these people just wait. And it ends up smoothing flow through the entire system. So even though these people weren't doing anything, you lowered the amount of rework that needed to be done and like lots of other good benefits to that. And so the overall throughput of the system was much higher. So that ends up being part of it. If you can get to blurred roles, which is like, all right, well, I don't only work in this column. This is just a visualization of what the entire team has to get done. Rather than doing more analysis, maybe you hop in on the do column. And so if they're blocked up, shit, pitch in. And like a big idea in Kanban is that like, you might not be a particularly good doer, but if it's better than nothing, you can help a little bit. Even if it's just like, to use a Boy Scouts metaphor, carrying someone else's backpack for them. So like if you're on a hiking, backpacking thing, you put the smallest, weakest kid first because that's how fast the entire group can move. And as soon as you do that, you go, okay, well, if we want the entire team to move faster, what can we do to make that kid faster? And so like maybe you take some stuff out of their backpack and distribute it among like bigger, stronger kids. Similar kind of idea in Kanban. You're constrained, the entire system is constrained by whatever the slowest column here is. And so if everybody can spot when something gets hot there and help it get through faster, the entire system becomes more efficient. And then over time, you go, okay, what can we do to simplify this? Are there things like this cycle right here that we can streamline so that you never have to redo or retest something? That like something like test first development, can we change how these columns work so that doesn't have to cycle anymore? And so you can incrementally agilify your entire process from any starting point with something like this. These are also called pull systems. If I have 3 items in this column, and I have 2 over here, and 1 here, this one, even if it's done, can't move over into this column until there's room. And so once this moves into the next column, then it pulls this one in, which pulls that one in. And so like dedicated Kanban tools will like do that part for you. But rather than trying to push work through this system, you're trying to clear up capacity down the road so that you can pull work through the system. If there's like part of that that sounds counterintuitive, it has to do with queuing theory. So I gave a talk a little while back where I talked about some of this. But the TLDR on it is that if you operate at capacity all the time, any disruption to that will crash your entire system. And so you always want to operate well under capacity. So like the metaphor people like to use is like, well, your car can do 8,000 RPMs. If you do that all the time, you're going to burn your engine out. It might need to burst to that for very short periods, but you need to have capacity to do that in the first place. And like, so it goes with velocity and stuff. I'm on slides.com. Help a brother out. I got a real good visualization for this. All right, well, that's not going to work. But general idea is about flow. And flow is enhanced by having a consistent system. All right, that is an overview of Kanban. And that's an overview of these 3 Agile systems. Ask me some questions about them.
So when you looking for a job, is it wise to look at how they actually manufacture their product? Like,
Yes.
do they use? Okay.
Yeah, I would. That's probably one of the most important things for me. And in there's very few organizations that do any of these things especially well. And I always tell them, like, that's cool if you're interested in doing them well. I can help get you there, but um, there's a lot of called scrum butts. So scrum butt.
What was that again?
Scrum butt. So Scrum butt is, well, we're Scrum, but we don't have a product owner. We're Scrum, but we work in 4-month-long sprints. We're Scrum, but all the work gets assigned by a manager. That's not Scrum. I'm not interested in doing Scrum but work because inevitably that ends up being, we tried baseball and it didn't work, which is one of my favorite Agile stories. But a bunch of people try to improve baseball and they change the shape of the diamond and how many people are on the field and lots of other things. And I go, well, baseball doesn't scale. Even with all the improvements we made, the game isn't any fun. So very similar kind of thing with this. So I don't like doing Scrum but if any organization wants to do actual Scrum or actual XP or actual Kanban, I like helping them get there.
Are these at all more common in startup environments, newer organizations?
I wouldn't say there's a super consistent alignment on that. XP is primarily these days practiced by Pivotal and anybody who's come in contact with Pivotal. There's elements of it, like you'll see some places that do some pairing or some test first stuff. But whenever you see something that really looks like XP, it's a pretty good chance that they had Pivotal consulting for them at some point. So like Dish Networks would fall under that. There's a couple other agencies in town that do a lot of like very XP style training. Scrum is like 10 to 1 more common, but that's another one that isn't very authentically practiced in a ton of different places. I wouldn't say either of those have much to do with size. They have to do with who's in charge. So if the person in charge like actually gets this stuff, then it works with an organization of any size. If somebody read a Harvard Business Review article, because Agile is on the cover like 3 times a year, then you're probably going to end up with some Scrum butt bullshit. And the worst, the most insidious is this shit called SAFe, which has nothing to do with Agile. It's this goddamn
yeah, I remember.
Where we do some XP and we do some Scrum and we do some Kanban. We have this. This is all prediction. There's nothing Agile about that. But
gotta get Shingy to talk about it. Gotta get him.
But like, there's a lot of places that are doing SAFe right now, and that's like an instant no for me. And there's also like, these are 3 very good systems. You can also be very agile and not do anything even resembling one of these. Like our instructional team, super agile. I wouldn't say anything we do resembles any of these 3 things really. These are just ways to like live by the principles and values. There are others.
Are there like a sector where one is like mostly valuable than other 2?
With these 3 systems?
Yeah.
I was a really hardcore Scrum guy for a long time. the last year in particular, I've become a little bit of an XP zealot. So my thinking was, I like that Scrum codifies this, like these working relationships in like a very sane way. And I liked that it didn't have opinions about how the work should be done, because it feels like those like immediately come into conflict. It's like, no, we trust you. You're an empowered team member. Also, you have to pair every fucking time. You better TDD every fucking time. Like it felt like that. Those two things didn't add up. The reality I have come to believe is that these quality practices are so good that it is insane not to do them. It's like you're not interested in making quality software if you're not embracing some of our finest quality tools. So these should be a rule of engagement. And while I still like borrow pretty heavily from Scrum's organizational system, I don't know, like working on agile education teams for the last 5 years that don't follow any of these systems, I guess I'm a little bit less fussy about that kind of stuff too. And there's some of these things like points and velocity that I think are very powerful tools, but they're also the easiest to weaponize against an agile team. Because as soon as somebody sees points and velocity, some like non-agile manager, it's the thing they try to min-max. It's the thing they try to beat up the team with. Or like, I've heard of teams where like you get punished if you don't deliver a certain number of story points. Like as a team member is like, I only did 4 points and this other person did 6 points, which is not how points were ever supposed to work. An individual doesn't have points, the team has points. Because there are people that do glue work, there's people who just make other people better, that have like fairly diffuse contributions, and so you wouldn't be able to trace a point specifically back to them, but they have a thumb in every point. And so like, or velocity is another one. Velocity isn't a thing you're supposed to raise or lower or anything. I call it the can on the chicken wire around your farm. You want it to say level. If it goes up or if it goes down, that's the can rattling. Might be a coyote, it might be somebody coming to steal your shit, it might be the wind. It's just an indication that you might need to go investigate. So if points are going down, is it because we estimated stuff poorly? Is it because it's getting harder and harder to work with the system? That might mean that like we started cutting some corners. If our velocity is going up, likewise, that might mean that we're cutting some corners. That like, why are we suddenly so much more productive? That's curious. Might mean people are getting softer on their estimates. And like neither of those things are explicitly problems. They're just calling your attention that like something's different now. But fucking give any manager some line and they want to turn it into an up and to the right graph. So there's been a movement in Agile away from points and away from velocity. In particular, there's a movement called no estimates. And it's actually a pretty powerful idea. The idea of no estimates is you break down every work item down to the point where it's effectively a 1-pointer. And now you don't point anything anymore. You just say how many work items you got through the system. That's another one of the upsides to doing something like t-shirt sizes for points is you can't do math with them. So no manager gets inclined to like come up with min-max formulas. Other questions about these agile systems of ours? Cool. Thanks for letting me talk about my favorite thing. Hopefully that was
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you.